I'm not sure how much time we have for questions.
10 minutes.
About 10 minutes, wonderful. I would like to open the floor to questions, particularly to start off with to our science, tech and research team. So if you're part of that team and you have a question, you get to go first. So we'll do Jack and then Yakao, and then David. And then we'll open to everyone else.
First of all, congratulations on a terrific report.
Thank you.
There's much in there that is also reflected in the Nelson Tasman Climate Action book. So
Right.
we're clearly on the same path. There's a couple of areas that, to me, still need some attention. One is the goal. The emissions projections for staying within 1.5, as I understand it, have a 66% chance of success, which seems to me a rather weak target, and perhaps you could speak to that. Two other questions and points, and one is, within the advice document that you've prepared, the way I read it, there's a critique of the ETS, which is one of our main mechanisms for mitigation, basically, as I understand it, saying it's not really fit for purpose. And, well, I mean, you did it in a very politely way. Very polite way, very diplomatic indeed. But is any consideration being given to a more robust system that has some certainty in terms of emissions, like a rationing system, for example? And the last item that perhaps would be helpful to get some feedback on is the role of the current electricity system. It seems to me that the privatization and the focus on profit is really contradictory to a well-being approach, and there's several aspects to it that I suggest tinkering with it is not going to really allow us to get our targets, and that some more radical transformation of that system may be necessary. Thank you.
Wow, great questions. Let's see if I can remember them all. So maybe starting with the targets, and yeah, you're right. This whole exercise is informed by the science, and those scenarios talk about having a 66% chance of stopping at no more than 1.5 degrees. That report's 2.5 years old now, and the science has moved on even since then, and every day it's looking more urgent. I think, sorry, if I go back, it's working, okay. The long-lived gases on the left there, the sort of scenario range, does include on the more ambitious side getting to zero by more like 2040 and 2050. And I think if we want to have more certainty, then that's the kind of approach we should be taking. So it's in there, and the pathway that's the sort of central pathway, the blue line, is on the more ambitious side. So I'm hopeful personally that we can actually get to zero CO2 sooner than 2050, and that would definitely give more certainty. The ETS is an instrument. It hasn't performed as well as it could have in the last decade or more, but it's not necessarily a bad thing, and in fact it exists. It is a tool, and I think it could be used better. So the Commission is suggesting that basically the carbon price could go up, and that would be a good thing. And I've already forgotten the last part of your question.
Electricity system.
Oh, the electricity system, yes. Yeah, couldn't have put it better myself. I think, privatisation and the profit motive is what's got us into this problem, basically. And if I could wave a magic wand, it would be great to undo some of those changes that happened in the late 1980s. But what government chooses to do about this, I guess, is up to our elected representatives. The Commission doesn't make strong recommendations about that kind of thing, but I think a more nationally coordinated system is bound to produce dividends.
Yeah, I can just add a little bit more to the question about the emissions trading scheme. So as you mentioned, like a more certain scheme with some rationing, there is already trends in that direction. The more recent reforms to the ETS passed by the government now introduce a cap, which is going to be a sinking cap. So before we had an emissions trading scheme without a cap on it, which kind of undermined all of it. But now there is an emissions cap, which hopefully the government will align with our emissions budgets. And so it will sink, and that will hopefully give a lot more certainty. And the emissions and the Climate Change Commission will have an ongoing role to advise about allocation of units within that, which will also provide some more certainty. And it's also important to know that the ETS is just one tool, and that alone is not going to be enough. There are lots of actions that need to happen that are not super sensitive to changes in the carbon price between what's realistic, such as the adoption of electric vehicles, where a lot of other supporting policies will be needed to get the change that we need. And perhaps the biggest critique we have about the ETS is the balance of incentives towards planting exotic forests, and we have recommendations around needing to make changes in that front in order to get the forest trajectory that we talk about, which is that additional emphasis on native forests that James talked about.
Sure, thank you. So we'll go to Yakal next, and then I thought maybe for gender balance there might be a woman in the room who has a question. So have a think about that now.
And thanks, James. I could only reinforce Jack's concerns and reiterate that the focus or tolerance of profit-centered behaviour in the private sector runs strongly against us achieving these goals. My question was a little bit more specific. I know it's actually conveniently on the slide that you've got up there. I'm interested, I hadn't seen it before, but that the 2050 target range for biogenic methane actually extends beyond any calculated scenarios. I'm interested that one would actually allow a target that's spread beyond. Could you fill me in?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, really good point. Yeah, so the shading goes below the bottom of the target range. So the legislation talks about 24 to 47% reduction in methane by 2050. But the analysis the Commission's done, and when you read it, you see this headwind scenario, tailwind scenario, so there's various assumptions made about what difficulties might be thrown up over the next couple of decades and what improvements might be made, what new technology might come along and so on, and the tailwinds. So the analysis is that we could go below the 47% reduction by 2050. It's not the central pathway assumed, but it's possible. I guess it's on the unlikely side at the moment, I suppose you could say, but it is possible. And if we can go faster than the legislation allows, then why not? It's a bit like the long-lived gases, zero net CO2 by 2050, but we might be able to get there by 2040, so why not? And go below.
Thank you. Oh, what another good question. Deb's over to you first. Jessie, will you please help us keep time? Let me know how much time we have.
Kia ora, James. It's good to see you back on the top of the staff again. Te koehu. Rod Oram wrote an article in the paper, and I work for Forest and Birds, so I've got a complete bias towards our native biodiversity. But in it, it quotes, "It completely failed to investigate how nature, through ecosystems and biodiversity, is both our greatest climate change threat and our greatest climate change opportunity." Have you got any response to that statement, please?
Sure. So I don't know if everyone's seen it, but one of Rod Oram's recent columns talked about this and how nature-based solutions are not emphasised anywhere near enough in the draft advice. And I think it's a fair comment generally. This is draft advice, and while it's been really excellent work, we haven't covered everything as well as it could have been covered, and maybe the emphasis should be changed a bit. So I guess the first thing I'd say is the Commission really welcomes some good submissions on this, and there's a conversation going on with Rod Oram around some of these things at the moment. And yeah, biodiversity is mentioned in the report and native tree planting and so on, but I think perhaps there could be more emphasis on things like regenerative agriculture and soil carbon and those kind of positive effects from restoring biodiversity or not allowing biodiversity to degrade anymore. So, given this is your area of expertise, then maybe I should be quiet now. But yeah, I could well imagine that given the feedback we get, the final advice does have more emphasis on that, and that may well be a good thing.
Yeah, I would just add, since a lot of poring over all the options in the land-based sector that might have gone into the report, and we did look at a whole range of other nature-based solutions that perhaps don't feature strongly in terms of the pathway that we have. And I would say that the large focus on a scale of native reforestation New Zealand hasn't seen in a long time is one important nature-based solution there. There's more ways that can be expanded upon. We often get a lot of interest from people asking us about whether it's coastal ecosystems and wetlands and integrating more trees and nature into like urban areas. And that's really exciting. Part of our job is we have to kind of in our DNAs to be a very strong evidence-based organisation, which is kind of in our makeup. And so we did a big kind of survey of all the kind of research and evidence out there. There's a lot of interesting stuff and great ideas, but for a lot of them, the kind of concrete evidence that you'd want to use to build policies on in New Zealand is still under development. And there's a lot of great organisations in New Zealand doing research on those. And actually in our report, we try to kind of point to some of these and say, hey, we need to look at this more. We really welcome feedback from people who can either provide more great evidence that we haven't seen, might have missed, so that we can build it more into our pathways, or to help us highlight what can be improved, as James said, if we need to strengthen some of our wording around areas that should be further explored or more research done. So we certainly support the potential of it, but want to work together with the community to build an evidence-based approach to this.
Sure, thank you. David, has your question been answered, or do you still have one? It has, lovely. Okay, to the room then.
Tēnā koutou katoa. From the from a global perspective, Professor, what's your advice, or how do you advise our government to hold the other governments into account with their NDC, with their nationally determined contributions, knowing that it's not legally binding in the Paris Agreement? What's the measures to incentivize countries to come on board? Do you do a scaremongering, like if you don't do this, you're going to die? And stuff? But it's just really from a layman's point of view. And also, without pinpointing certain countries who are doing the dirty, if you like, because we don't want countries and then their people being targeted or stigmatized because their country's not doing well, from a multicultural point of view. Kia ora.
Kia ora, that's a great question. And I guess it's outside the scope of this advice because it's talking about international cooperation and collaboration. But that is built into the Paris Agreement, the idea, and there's the COP meeting in Glasgow at the end of this year, where countries need to put their new NDCs on the table and demonstrate that they've upped their ambition. This whole idea of increasing ambition over time is the foundation, I guess, of how the Paris Agreement works. But you're right, it's not binding. But if countries miss their targets, they do need to pay basically through, international offsetting essentially. So it's not completely, you don't get a free pass. But I think the role that Aotearoa can play is in leading the way and helping other countries to do the same. And I take heart from the fact that, the US, as of today or yesterday's back in the Paris Agreement, and the government seems pretty onto it now. The Chinese have a net zero CO2 target for 2060, I think. Japanese 2050, you know, Britain and the EU, etc. Not every state, I think India and Brazil maybe are still to get there, but that is the way things are going. So there is no international police force around this. It is a moral argument ultimately. But I think as the climate keeps changing, the pressure is going on more and more, and unfortunately, you know, damage from extreme events is becoming more obvious in some parts of the world at least, and that will drive change. And basically, the bottom line, as economic costs become greater, that really puts pressure on governments to basically save money. And spending money on mitigation is a great investment. So maybe that's an unsatisfying answer, but I'm actually quite hopeful at this stage that we will see a lot of action in the next decade. We'd better.
Yeah.
I'm going to take the last question, if that's okay. The Climate Forum has adopted 3 goals on behalf of its community. Mitigation, effectively, which your report obviously deals with, adaptation, and the third is about a broad kind of interpretation of a just transition. So it's about upholding the rights and the dignity of everybody involved, including other species. And I'm just wondering how your advice connects with a just transition.
Well, the advice is informed by that idea of a just transition, and the goal is not to disadvantage any particular group. You know, obviously, if we're getting out of coal or getting out of oil and gas, then there are people in those sectors who would lose jobs, and that basically the Commission points to that and says government needs to find ways to help those sectors, help those communities to transition into something more sustainable, renewable. So that's I guess an underpinning philosophy of the advice the Commission has come up with. And you mentioned adaptation. That is another part of the Commission's mandate that's coming along. We've had the adaptation. The risk, climate change risk report came out last year, yeah. So work's gone on there, and the Commission will be looking at that, and the government has a couple of years to respond to that, so the Commission will be swinging into action on that towards the end of that period. But it is, in my mind, it is woven through the whole advice and the whole thinking of the Commission to provide a just transition, to bring all of Aotearoa along and get us to this greener future in a way that really doesn't hurt any particular community. I can't say much more than that really, but you mentioned all species, and this comes back to biodiversity, I suppose, and I think there are all sorts of co-benefits of stopping burning fossil fuels, public health benefits. Increasing biodiversity is going to help, obviously, native biodiversity generally. So I think if the advice of the Commission's taken up the way it's written at the moment, and if that is combined with the work of other government agencies, DOC, etc., and Forest and Bird and all of these other NGOs and community groups, then I think we can make a real difference for life generally. At least I hope so. Anyway.
Thank you so much for your time.